Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Really glad you're with us for the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. It's a special edition of the podcast today. As mentioned earlier in the week, I am away, and now Jim is away. So, Jim, in our special edition today, we are going to be talking about what went right for Donald Trump, why he won, why Kamala Harris lost, and there's myriads of factors on both sides. And then in the last section, we'll kind of talk about how the media, the mainstream media, really took one on the chin this year, as well as some other winners and losers who were not on the actual ballot this year. So let's start with Donald Trump's victory. When we spoke on Tuesday, I don't think either one of us expected to know Wednesday morning whether anybody won this race, much less as decisively as Trump seems to have done it. And so, first of all, Jim, regardless of what people think of Donald Trump, he was one of the most resilient people, politically or otherwise, that you can imagine, considering everything that happened to him, some of it of his own making in terms of political controversy and so forth. But in terms of, he was indicted a billion times. He was shot once, got up from that. I think the fight probably helped him, especially among the working class, which he was very much popular with. He was much more direct on the issues, not always precise with his language, but people know where he stands on the border. They know where he stands with tax cuts because his tax cuts are about to expire, and he's obviously going to be more in favor of keeping those than others. Crime, cultural issues, saying flat out that, men don't belong in women's sports, and the Democrats constantly hedging on that. And so there's a lot of reasons why he won. I think you got to give credit to Elon Musk in the Get Out the Vote campaign and others who were doing that sort of thing, registering people to vote in the swing states, and ultimately it all came together for a pretty big win.
Greg, a couple of days before the election, my colleague Michael Brennan Doherty said something that was unbelievably simple and yet clarified a lot. And he just kind of was offhand saying, I think Biden won in 2020 because a lot of Americans were just sick of COVID and felt that like by voting for a new president, it would end the pandemic. And there was some criticism of the way Trump had done it. But if you look back, heading into as of like March 2020, Trump looked like a pretty good bet for re-election. The economy was roaring. And I think, by the way, that was a big factor in how people felt about Trump in 2024. They had a great deal of nostalgia for the pre-COVID economy, and they did not blame Trump for the problems of the pandemic. I think to a lot of Democrats, that's baffling and unbelievable, but they just see the pandemic as a bad thing that happened that ruined this good economy Trump had built, and that if you put Trump back in there, we'll get back to that. I also think that, so there's economic nostalgia, but I also think there's a certain level of economic honesty. We can argue about whether America is a hellhole or carnage or whatever terms Trump was describing it. But a good chunk of the last 4 years have been the Biden administration and then Kamala Harris insisting you've never had it so good. Look at the low unemployment rate. Things are going fantastic. You don't appreciate just how good this economy is. And a lot of Americans would look at their grocery bills and look at their gas bills and say, what are you talking about? I'm struggling to get by here. Everything is way more expensive than it's ever been. Even if I got a raise last year, I still feel like I'm not keeping up. I feel like every time I go to the store, things are so much worse than I thought they were going to be. And that is cumulative. Like people, go back to Jimmy Carter. Inflation destroys presidencies, right? So there was a certain, you can argue Trump is hyperbolic and Trump is, exaggerates and all that stuff. But that's why people insist Trump's the only guy who tells the truth, is that they feel like he was talking about their problems and their concerns in a way that everybody else in the administration and everybody else in the media, I don't want to foreshadow our next martini, but that they did not. I guess I'll save some of this other stuff for the problems of the Biden administration. But there was a sense that he was being honest about the problems. He wasn't sugarcoating it. And that they felt good about how he had been president last time. And then finally, I guess the third thing is we can argue about whether January 6th and Trump stopped the steal claim and all that stuff from last time should be disqualifying. But clearly the American people did not think it was disqualifying. And this was abundantly clear really by the beginning of this year. Right? It was Trump was running neck and neck with Biden pretty close after this election. The indictments, by the way, you think Alvin Bragg feels great right now? Alvin Bragg, who, if he hadn't, because he indicted Trump, and that was when DeSantis lost a lot of ground. It looked like DeSantis might have had a shot early on in the Republican primaries. And then everybody, kind of gathered around Trump, and really the Republican primary was never competitive. And once again, Democrats were convinced we want Trump to be that nominee because we think he's the easiest to beat. Nobody asked Hillary Clinton how that works out for them. And here they are again. So it is very much like Zool, choose the form of your destructor. And Democrats, instead of thinking the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, thought of the orange guy from The Apprentice, and he came along and he destroyed them a second time. And I think this one is going to feel much more devastating than the one in 2016.
And there's a lot of people on the left, whether they've been there a long time or recently joined the cause because of Trump, who had this probably a fever dream of him in an orange jumpsuit and headed to prison. That's not going to happen. I mean, I guess Merchan's still going to sentence him to something. I don't know how that's all going to play out, but this whole idea that he was, going to spend the rest of his life behind bars doesn't look like that's going to be the case. A lot of different things the Trump campaign did well. They had a very clear plan to go after Joe Biden. And even after the Democrats pulled the plug on Joe and threw Kamala out there, it took them a little while to get their footing and figure out what was going to be effective. We'll talk about the problems that she had along the way, but eventually just drilling down again on the issues, not making it about her as much, but explaining, what you would do and that you identify with the problem. And that really made a difference. All right, let's talk about more help for Democrats or Republicans. Maybe you need therapy for a variety of reasons. Today's episode of the Three Martini Lunch is brought to you by BetterHelp. And whether it's your family, whether it's your work, whether it's what's going on in politics and the world right now, there's a lot of stressors out there. And maybe it's tough for you right now to come up with a lot of good ideas and reasons to be thankful this Thanksgiving season. But it's important to develop gratitude because that will give you much more peace of mind. And if you need more help with that, check out BetterHelp. All therapists are licensed, accredited professionals. It allows you to connect with them on a safe and convenient online environment. It's affordable. Just pay a low flat fee for both live sessions as well as messaging with your therapist because it doesn't have to be expensive. And it's convenient. Do it at your own time and at your own pace. Communicate with your therapist as often as you want and whenever you feel that it is needed. So let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/3ml today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/3ml. All right, Jim, on to our second martini here. What went wrong for Kamala Harris? Well, there's a lot of things. We talked actually a few days, maybe a week or two before the election, about the already emerging excuses for a Harris loss. And the two big ones were the fact that she was never really a candidate until July. The Democrats specifically and intentionally snuffed out any attempt to seriously challenge Joe Biden. You had a couple of gadflies in Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, but that was never going anywhere. So they protected Biden until the debate. And you're still not going to be able to convince me that the Democrats knew that debate performance was coming, and that's why there was one in June. But that's perhaps for another discussion. But nonetheless, once they finally forced Biden's hand, it had to be Harris for a variety of reasons. And so she got thrust into that role. They did the best they could with all the spin and the PR and the glitz of the convention and all the Hollywood endorsements and all that. But she was who we thought she was because she was a very ineffective and unimpressive vice president. The word salad started coming out as soon as she started getting real questions. The Biden record was around her neck the whole time, and she, for whatever reason, and we speculated about this in the past, refused to really separate herself on that, other than to say she's different than Joe Biden, but not saying how she'd be different than Joe Biden. The Tim Walz selection, obviously, flip-flopping on major positions that she had 4 years ago. And just like Joy Reid, trying to divide on race and gender and all sorts of other things, class in some ways, too. So a lot of different areas you could focus on here. But what do you think were the biggest mistakes from the Harris campaign?
Well, Greg, first we should remind our listeners, because we're discussing what went wrong for the Kamala Harris campaign, I hope you're enjoying the first 4-hour edition of the Three Martini Lunch. So before we get into why Harris lost, I think it's good to go back and understand why Joe Biden was trailing, really leading into that debate and, eventually leading to this. To foresee that age was going to be a serious issue for Joe Biden if he sought a second term, you needed this very complicated prognostication tool called a calendar. And part of the problem, I think, is that Joe Biden's, ironically, he was vice president to Barack Obama, and I think we all remember the birth certificate controversy there. Well, the controversy about Joe Biden's birth certificate is a stone tablet. Parchment had not yet been invented. And so, yeah, he was really, really old. And he had even talked about being a bridge candidate back when he was running in 2019. And everybody had kind of expected, okay, Biden's going to be a one-term guy, and then we're going to pass the torch to the vice president. They figured Harris would be a more popular vice president than she turned out to be. And so Biden decided to run for a second term. Clearly, Democrats should have pressured him to say, no, Joe, you can't do this significantly earlier. I think one of the things I observed about election night on Tuesday night was that, well, the red wave arrived just 2 years late. One of my readers pointed out that, ironically, that may have led to Trump's victory in 2024, in that traditionally midterm elections go bad for the incumbent party. And we thought Biden was going to have a really bad one. Yeah, Republicans won the House, but by a very small margin. And 2022 was seen as a real disappointment for Republicans and kind of a big win for Biden. So Biden from that concluded, I'm really good at this. I should stay around for another term. And I think if he'd had a typically bad midterm, you would have seen more Democrats saying, okay, Joe, thank you for your service. Time to hang it up. And you probably would have had Harris might well have still won the Democratic, primary, but there would have been a contest. There would have been a bit more road testing. There would have been a lot more, what positions do you have from 2019 that you still have? Which ones have you changed? All that kind of stuff. So that was a big problem, is that she went into this, being the Democratic nominee with an approval rating in like the mid to upper 30s. That's lousy. That's a really bad spot to start from. Now, a bunch of it surged up, but if you looked into the numbers, it was entirely because Democrats who had been really kind of meh on her as vice president instantly fell in love the moment they saw the first coconut tree meme. And that the laugh and joy, and they fell in love. Independents and Republicans were never going to give her a chance, I don't think. And independents were not wowed. They liked her better than Biden, and a whole bunch of polls where it looked like a whole bunch of states where it looked like Biden was going to get trashed, including our home state of Virginia. She got it back into competitive range, and he pulled ahead in a couple of the traditionally blue ones. But really, it was an illusion of the level of her strength of that, and she would have been better off with the primary. Now, I don't know if Gavin Newsom would have done a dramatically different result than we saw this week. I think the biggest problem. Why did Harris lose? Well, because the Biden administration had a really lousy record. And it wasn't just bad results, although that's clearly very bad, inflation, et cetera. It was that Joe Biden kept coming out and saying, no serious economist says we're going to have sustained high inflation. And then we said, sustained high inflation. You're not going to see helicopters taken off from the embassy of Afghanistan. The Afghan army is the best prepared, and then we saw the debacle in Afghanistan. Early on, contacts at the border skyrocketed right up. Joe Biden insisted, it's just a regular seasonal pattern. Joe Biden kept lying to the American, or either lying or making predictions that did not pan out. Joe Biden was spending a lot of time telling Americans, don't worry, it's going to be fine. And then it turned out to not be fine, right? So that was the environment she was stepping into. And the first thing was that she was not very, weirdly, I saw Dana Bash said at one point, because of the abbreviation of her campaign, she didn't have enough time to introduce herself. What's she been doing? Like not just she's been vice president. She's run for president twice in the last 5 years, right? Like you'd think at that point you'd introduce yourself. People would have some sense of what they think about you. And I think what did it. I mean, maybe you look at these numbers and say there was no way she was going to win. But okay, first of all, Tim Walz, arguably the worst pick of all time. Maybe you could point to John Edwards and a couple other ones that were kind of stinkers, but. Boy, he did not add anything. And in fact, you look at the polling numbers of what Harris was doing before she picked Walz, and after the Walz pick, she lost ground. He cost her votes in Minnesota. He did not help her. So I don't believe that he did any good in any of the blue wall states. But also just simply not doing the interviews once she was the nominee. I think that said to Americans who were kind of instinctively skeptical and may have memories of that 2019 campaign. She seemed very far left. She's a San Francisco liberal, et cetera. The fact that she was so evasive about her position changes and stuff like that, it said to them, she's not telling you who she really is. You don't really see what she really wants to stand for. You get this woman in office, she's going to push as hard to the left as possible. And, you could say because of the record, because of high inflation, because of chaos overseas, she always had a challenging environment. It's tougher when you take over as a nominee in the middle of summer. But in the end, no, she didn't run a particularly great campaign. And I know people are going to be throwing in my, don't underestimate her column at me for a while. I will point out, I think she's going to have at least the fourth most, maybe the third most votes of all time. So as bad as she was, she did still manage to get a good chunk of the Democratic vote out. Trump did a much better job, and I think he won the independents pretty handily.
What do you think Kamala does now? I don't think she necessarily runs again in 4 years. California politics are already dominated by Democrats, so she'd have to run against another Democrat. Maybe there's an open seat somewhere. Or maybe she just takes a job and gets super rich.
Yeah, I think she's going to try to do the Obama retirement plan, except she won't have the 2 terms of president to do it. She is, I think, the third biggest loser of this election. Now, people might be surprised by that, but I think the second biggest loser, Maya Rudolph, who does her so well on Saturday Night Live and was going to be in the cold open sketch for the next 4 to 8 years. Yeah. Maya Rudolph can be on Saturday Night Live whenever she wants, but this was going to be her iconic character. And then the single biggest loser of this election is the Grover Cleveland fan base and historical society, because just not as special as he was a couple of days ago.
Exactly. There's a guy named Troy Senik who wrote a biography a year or two ago about Grover Cleveland, and he just tweeted out either last night or this morning, "You have no idea how many edits I need to make now before the second printing of this book." So
the only
anyway.
cross, the one of 2 people elected president twice, non-consecutive terms. So.
Amazing. Well, in a moment, the other winners and losers, the people who were not on the ballot, who definitely have some consequences to deal with as a result of this election. But before that, if you're still celebrating extensively from the election, or you're still really, really feeling bad about the election, may I suggest Z-Biotics before you start drinking? Because Z-Biotics, if you take it before you start drinking, you will feel much better the next morning than you would have otherwise.
Z-Biotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. PhD scientists invented it to tackle your rough mornings after drinking. Now, here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. And it's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next morning. Z-Biotics pre-alcohol produces an enzyme that breaks this byproduct down. So just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, as I'm sure you always do, and you'll feel your best the next morning.
I've got a colleague who definitely knew his limits, had no problems the next morning. Then all of a sudden, as he got older, there were some problems in the next morning. And so he tried Z-Biotics, hasn't had a problem since. Go to zbiotics.com/3ml to get 15% off your first order when you use 3ml at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantees, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Visit zbiotics.com/3ml and use the code 3ml at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, Z-Biotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times. All right, Jim, time for some fun here in the Crazy Martini in this special edition. The winners and losers who weren't actually on the ballot in this presidential election. So we've already talked about Trump and Harris, but who else has egg on their face? Who else is looking pretty darn good? So let's go with the winners, first of all. I would say that Elon Musk is definitely a winner, given his get out the vote efforts, and also the fact that he owns Twitter. Think about the fact that if the original regime still owned Twitter, what the campaign and what information might or might not have been able to get out there, kind of like it was with the Hunter Biden laptop back in 2020. Didn't have that issue this time. Some people say he saved free speech on the internet. Might be a bit exaggeration, but Elon Musk has played a huge role in this. The other aspect that I think bodes well for us, but I think it's also true, podcasting. Think about what a big deal it was for podcasters to be a factor in this campaign. Trump went all over the place. Joe Rogan interviewed him and Vance and actually made an endorsement that some people think made a difference among younger voters because Trump did better among them than usual, too. People on cable news, I think Scott Jennings is definitely a guy over at CNN who His stock is rising as a result of the way that he has kind of sat there with 3 or 4 other people with very different opinions on him, understanding and explaining how the American people, how the working class are actually looking at this election as opposed to people who seem to be stuck in the bubble somewhere. So I'm sure there's a lot of other ones out there, but who are your other winners?
Well, I just want to point out, Greg, most of this podcast is audio. We do little video snippets. They could not see my expression of frustration, as Elon Musk had been top of my list too, and you just said everything I was going to say on that. But that's okay. No, that's fine. We don't have this issue with our end of the year awards. So, I'm going to say an unusual name people might not expect, but Ron DeSantis, Proposition 4 going down in Florida. Look, since the Roe versus Wade decision, it's not that everything has gone wrong for the pro-life movement, but a lot of things have with big state referendum on things like that. This would have enshrined abortion in the state constitution of Florida, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
Went down. And that was not a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, there are a lot of Republicans who are like, Florida is not our most pro-life state. We're going to have a tough time. DeSantis put his weight behind it. He, campaigned on it, pulled out all the stops, and it was defeated. Early decision because Florida counts the votes remarkably fast, and every state should be listening, should be learning from their example. Another one that I think, it may sound obvious, but we're talking about Trump's victory. J.D. Vance, who I have some big disagreements with, stepped up big in every key moment of the race. Most notably, the debate with Tim Walz. Look, early on, the crazy cat lady's comments and stuff like that, it looked like this guy was going to be a liability. It looked like this guy was, had a tendency to put his foot in his mouth or to make points that even if you wanted to defend it, like the child tax credit, he managed to express it in ways that were very alienating and the most kind of, combative and obnoxious way. But J.D. Vance has game, has ability to modulate and, adjust his tone. And I think he really mopped the floor with Tim Walz in a way that Tim Walz did not expect. And I think I almost feel like that the vice presidential debate, which again, usually doesn't matter that much, feels like something of a turning point. That's when the joy of the Harris campaign ended. I think it's been a while. Look, Trump did not do well in his debate with Harris. I don't think it hurt him, obviously, but it probably was not the message that he and his supporters would have preferred to get out there. Vance went out and did it just the way he did, and did tons of Sunday show interviews. He was really good at all the combative messages. And look, if the second Trump term is like the first Trump term, I don't think I'm exaggerating, going out on a limb to say Trump is not a detail guy. Trump is not a guy who likes to get bogged down in the policies and all that kind of stuff. You can very easily see, Trump being the CEO of the White House and Vance being more of a chief operations officer, somebody who does handle the details and Trump's right-hand man. So he can have a lot of power in a second Trump term and maybe, kind of underestimated in a bunch of different ways. So, and look, if, God forbid anything happens to Trump, and let's point out, we'll be praying for his safety. We should be after 2 assassination attempts. A 78-year-old presidency, it's not unthinkable that at some point J.D. Vance has to step into the office of the presidency. And 3 years ago, this guy was not in office. Like that, this is a remarkable rise through to some of the highest heights of American politics.
No, it's absolutely incredible. Yeah, he did turn out to be an asset big time for the Republican ticket. His ability to go toe-to-toe on the Sunday morning shows, he took on all comers from the mainstream media and gave as good as he got. I think gave a template for how to deal with some of those questions with really biased premises and that sort of thing. He would actually, the Martha Raddatz exchange where Martha's like, it was just a few apartment buildings that the illegal gangs took over. Are you listening to yourself? And so things like that. And by the way, he'll be the youngest vice president since Richard Nixon. He's only 40 years old. He's going to take over at 40 years old. We're actually going to have somebody a heartbeat away from the presidency, born in the 80s. So that's quite something.
Most presidents and vice presidents are well past their midlife crisis by the time they're in office.
That's true. Especially the current one. He's not even half Biden's age. And then so also a big winner, I think, is the Border Patrol. I think they're probably going to like the policies coming forward a lot better than others. And there's a lot of other ones as well. I'm glad you mentioned Ron DeSantis and the political heft he put behind the abortion and the marijuana referendum, defeating both of those down there, which was great. In terms of the losers, I think the biggest one is the mainstream media. They were just absolutely shameless about their advancement of Harris, excusing her not showing up for interviews for weeks on end, explaining away her inability to answer questions and stuff. They're very biased questions towards Trump and Vance. The 60 Minutes debacle, which no transcript and editing very deceptively and that sort of thing, and just trying to put their thumb on the scale. The fact that the majority of the American voters, it seems like, rejected that definitely is a feather in their cap. I would also say Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and anyone else involved with shoving Joe Biden out the door. They thought that was the ticket to avoiding certain defeat. They didn't get what they wanted. I think Obama was actually reluctant about Harris as the choice at first, but he was out there a lot at the end, and he had lost the joy by the end too. He was looking pretty darn upset with people in the final stages. Obviously, Jack Smith is going to be looking for work soon, I would suggest, and Merrick Garland along the way too. So maybe even Chris Wray. I think there's going to be some changes coming to D.C.
On the media, this is, first of all, like the entire, one of the things I thought was very revealing, the closer we got to Election Day, is the distinction between Trump or the most controversial Republican imaginable and someone like McCormick in Pennsylvania just disappeared. That basically every Republican was seen as bad as Trump and therefore someone who had to be destroyed. And one of the dynamics I think we've seen in the media that kind of gets worse each year. Greg, do you remember when like Elon Musk was the guy who sent off rockets and had the cool electric cars and he's the real world Tony Stark and everybody loved him.
Yes.
And then he started saying things that were, I'm not even sure he'd say he's conservative. I think just merely anti-left. And he suddenly became the scariest threat to democracy and America that you could ever possibly imagine. In fact, I'm not going to say this was from Democratic officials or anything, but I'll just say ordinary progressives who said, why is this South African telling us how we're supposed to run our country? Now, Elon Musk is a U.S. citizen. Now, I thought the worst thing you could do was to treat a legal immigrant like they're not really an American. And by the way, I do genuinely believe that stuff. So, all of a sudden, Elon Musk is born in South Africa, so he's not really an American? Is that how we're going to play these games now? Okay, all right, I can live with that rule. I mean, technically, he's African American.
That's right.
Yeah. So the degree to which we saw, there's a joke going around, I think it was a meme of, the milkshake duck, right? Some duck that, drinks milkshakes and everybody goes, oh, and then someone digs into the background of the milkshake duck. And it turns out the milkshake duck had some inappropriate tweets back in, 2010 or something like that. And all of a sudden milkshake duck has to be canceled, right? We have seen this phenomenon where a person rises to prominence and then the moment they doubt the majoritary, leftist narrative, then they become an enemy. Then they become someone who has to be destroyed. Then the research into their background and all that stuff. Hey, if the spouse of the Republican presidential nominee had beaten up an ex, do you think you'd hear about that? Do you think that would have been a big deal? Do you think Andy Samberg would be playing him as this big lovable guy in on Saturday Night Live? No, I don't think. I think we would have heard everything about Doug Emhoff. I could make some crude jokes here, but I won't. But I'll just kind of, Doug Emhoff. I strongly suspect he's a bad guy, and none of the coverage reflected that. The degree to which Tim Walz was covered as America's lovable dad, and he's folksy, and he likes to work on the car, and he's got these great stories about how he helped win the state championship on his defensive coordinator with his play the pick six play or whatever it was. If Tim Walz had been a Republican, we would have heard about how he's this gun-toting yokel who looks and sounds like Elmer Fudd and doesn't know what a venture capitalist is and describes himself as a knucklehead and had a relationship with the daughter of a guy in the Chinese communist. Like all the stuff that we found out in conservative media would have been the dominant narrative. But instead, he's a sitcom character. He's red green, as I said, and there was just a degree to which this dynamic became so clear. So on the one hand, the media did everything they could. They pulled out all the stops, and they failed. So yes, they are the biggest loser. But the other thing I'm going to note is that we've seen a lot of look. You and I have talked about media bias on this podcast, if not every episode, then in a lot of episodes, right? We don't deny that it exists, but I do think some Republicans use it as a crutch. Anytime a Republican says, "Well, I could have won," but the media was biased against me. Oh, I'm sorry. Was your campaign strategy to expect the media to be nice, that they were going to be friendly and on your side? Have you ever seen anything about how the media covers Republicans before? So I think that excuse is gone for Republicans. If you lose the race, you lost the race because you're a lousy candidate. It wasn't because the media was biased against you, because Trump has proven, and in a whole bunch of these races it's been proven, that Republicans can overcome a hostile media environment. Also, notice Donald Trump won despite being outspent, last I checked, 3-1. Do you think all those ads against Trump, did they matter? Did they make a difference in the end? Did they push the New York Times needle that by the end of the night, every Democrat was injecting into their arms with heroin? That was, there's this a whole bunch of what we do with campaigns. I don't know if it actually makes a difference. By the way, when you mentioned earlier the success of the Trump get out the vote operation, it's going to be very interesting to sort out what parts are credit to Charlie Kirk and Turning Point Action, what parts are credit to Elon Musk and America PAC, what parts are for Americans for Prosperity Action, and they're they didn't do it for Trump, but they did it for all the Republican Senates, and everybody's pointing out, you bring out people who want to vote for Republican Senate candidates, that usually works out pretty well for the Republican presidential nominee. Or a bunch of any of these other grassroots organizations who are all going to say, yes, I was the one that made the difference in all those swing states. I think this is the sort of moment it would be really good for the mainstream media to say, okay, what we did in 2024 didn't work on any level. It did not it did not persuade Americans. Americans don't trust us. Let's just say one of the men who pays me in more than one way made that observation in an op-ed recently, that the public does not trust big media in a lot of ways. And did it do the job we wanted it to do of informing the electorate about the positions of the two candidates? I'm not sure that it did. I think it got very easy to get candidates. A lot of columns were written about Kamala Harris and Joy because she wasn't doing interviews and there was nothing else to talk about. So there's a really fair question of, like I was feeling about the Jets after that loss to New England, tear it all down to the foundation, start over, figure out what your objective is, and figure out how to do it, and do your job better, and then probably everyone will be happier, the readers, the listeners, the viewers, and probably even the candidates you want to help.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Two, I will add, kind of jumping off on a couple of points you made. First of all, in terms of the media, you knew instantly how they were going to play the rest of this campaign once Harris jumped on board. The first thing we saw was she wasn't really the border czar, and Axios was even correcting its own reference to her as the border czar from 3 years earlier and saying, oh, that was inaccurate. That was our bad. I can't believe we said such an inaccurate thing back then when everyone called her that.
She was the migration czar. Now, where were the migrants going again?
Exactly. And finally, shout out to Steve Daines, the head of the Republican Senate Committee, picking candidates that could do well. I think the Republicans had better candidates this year in his own state, Tim Sheehy, and also, obviously, I don't know if he specifically recruited Bernie Moreno, but he recruited Sam Brown in Nevada, who may not win, but is definitely very much more competitive than otherwise thought. In any event, Jim, quite a bit to chew on, and I'm sure there will be reverberations for a while. So have a great weekend. See you Monday.
See you next week, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Please tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific weekend and join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.